Good evening. I'm Selwyn Collins, your host on CWS. Thank you for tuning in. Those of you who are coming in for the first time, let me take this opportunity to thank you very much. CWS is about having conversations with people about their journeys and how are they using their gifts and talents to help others. For those of you who have been here, my friends of the show, I want to thank you very much over the year. Last month was our 1-year anniversary. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your tolerance, actually, with the glitches now and then. I want to thank you very much for your loyalty. Tonight we have a very special guest, and you know, often we hear about and talk about 6 degrees of separation, and I've come to believe that there's no more 6 degrees of separation. With cyberspace, it has gone down to perhaps 2 degrees of separation, maybe 1. So this brother, Kojo Paris, is in South Africa at the moment, and it's 2:30, and he stayed up to have this conversation with us. I am extremely grateful and thankful for that. And tonight, I want to start with a quote by Marianne Williamson that says, "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We are all meant to shine, as children do. We were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It is not just in some of us, it's in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others." Why I chose this quote, among others, is because the first time I heard of it, I heard it from Nelson Mandela. And I was deeply, deeply moved, deeply touched. How could this man, who has spent so many years in prison, incarcerated, come out and be so bold and so powerful and so compassionate? And something transformed in me, that there is hope for humanity, providing we can find it within ourselves to be compassionate, to be tolerant. And so I say to you tonight, again, I am grateful that you have tuned in. And more importantly, I'm grateful that my friend and brother, Kojo Paris, who is all the way in South Africa, it's 2:30 in the morning, here to talk with us. Short break, and I'll introduce you to Kojo Paris. I'm back, and this is Selwyn Collins of CWS Conversations with Selwyn. My guest tonight is Cojo Paris. Kojo, my brother, you're on. Good evening, or good morning where you are.
Good morning, Selwyn, and it's a real pleasure to join you and your listeners on this show.
Wonderful. Thanks again for making this sacrifice, my brother. I'm hoping that by the end of this conversation, many of our listeners will have a wider or better perspective on who you are. Very often we meet people and we get to know one dimension of them. And then a forum like this presents itself, and hopefully by the end of the conversation we have a much more three-dimensional perspective on who you are and the things you do. So let's get started. There's much to talk about tonight. There are three topics before I get into who you are that we are going to talk about tonight, or three main topics: creating wealth, personal, community, and national, the black diaspora in Africa, and do we owe our homelands? Now that said, I want to just give a glimpse into who you are, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because I'm hoping that by the end of this conversation people will know more about you. Kojo is a visiting fellow at the University of Leeds, co-founder of the Roraima Fund and founder of the Roraima Learning Trust, former chairman of A4E Africa Homeless Talk, a newspaper benefiting the indigent of Johannesburg, and co-founder of Teach Zimbabwe, African Social Entrepreneurs Network and Social Private Equity South Africa, and conceived, structured, and launched the Social Entrepreneurship Certificate Program while leading the network of social entrepreneurs at Gibbs. He is an advisor, director to a number of social enterprises, including Cotlands, Colisa, Operation Hope Gauteng, and Open Africa. He leads the Social Value Metrics Group in an international network centered on the University of Leeds, exploring multivariate decision-making and metrics development, and lectures across the world on topics of social investment and political economy. And there's more. But so, Kojo, having said that, having read that, I want to ask you a question I ask every guest. Who is Cojo Paris?
It's funny, Selwyn, because as you were reading, I was trying to figure out who you were talking about. For me, it's very simple. I'm someone who's been incredibly lucky. I've mostly tried to work very hard, focusing on a few key aims and key values which are important to me. And along that way, there have been lots of people, family, strangers, friends, who've helped me on that journey. So I'm acutely aware of that, and as I continue my journey through life, I try as much as possible to return the favor, because I know that if I do that, then those of us making the journey will become more, and the journey will be easier. So in summary, that's what interests me.
I like that very much, because it speaks to a principle that I adopt and I adhere to, and that is success. When we should and must encourage each other's success, because I believe that success doesn't belong to the individual who is successful alone. It belongs to all of us, because I see success as a light, as a beacon that not only illuminates the individual, the successful individual, but it shines a light on others so that others can also find their switches, also remember or realize that they too can shine and may illuminate their paths to success. So I like what you've just said. And that said, I want to go into it by asking, what is it about you, a prominent and successful banking executive, that caused you to be attracted to social entrepreneurship in such a big way?
That's a big question, and I could bore you for hours on the answer to that, Selwyn. but let me try and let me give you a little bit of background. As I said before, I've been incredibly lucky. But in recognizing that, I also understand that there are certain prerequisites to success. If I didn't have the education I had, we wouldn't be having this conversation. If I didn't get access to healthcare and didn't have certain public and common goods available to me growing up, I grew up in Buxton. It's a little village in Ghana, and there are lots of people helped me, and all along the way, what I've seen is that much more than someone probably giving you a scholarship to study has been the extension of just goodness and social capital and, like as I said, education, healthcare, having a decent place to live. Those things are prerequisites for success. But they also are the glues which hold societies and communities together. So if I am to make any contribution, if I am ever to say thank you to the thousands of unknown people who've helped me along the way, I believe one credible way in which I could do that is by working in social enterprises. And social enterprises effectively look to create those sorts of goods. It's not focused primarily on making money. It says there's certain things which are prerequisite to making money, and that's what we try to do with social enterprises. So it's a very practical way in which I don't like using the term, but give back.
Right.
But also it makes my life easier, because if people around me are succeeding, then it's easier for me to succeed.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And is there a particular memory from childhood that still resonates with you to this day, which keeps you motivated?
There are lots, and here I must talk about my not just my relationship, but in a sense one of the examples to me which is very powerful. The older I get, the closer my relationship with my father gets, and there are lots of examples of what he's done in his life which have influenced me deeply. My father was a very senior person in government, but it's a very clear memory to me that when he would travel, and government officials all around the world, one of the reasons they travel is because they get lots of big allowances and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But he would bring it back. He would bring back most of those allowances. So, for example, if he was given, let's say, $1,000, he'd probably bring back about 700 or 800, and he would have that money returned to the government. And we hated him as kids, because that meant we didn't get, nice toys, we didn't necessarily get great shoes, etc. But it sent a very powerful example to me that, one, you can generally live on less than what you think you need, and certainly less than what you want, and also that there are lots of people out there who can use much better some of the excesses which you have. So I've been, as I said before, Selwyn, I've been extraordinarily lucky. I don't want for much in life, and that's partly because I know that I need less than I think I do.
That is
and that helps me to retain a certain perspective on things, and also I believe that I have a healthy disrespect for material things. Mm-hmm. They certainly don't feature prominently in my scheme of things.
Mm-hmm. Listening to you describe your experiences with your father and him bringing back this money and sending it back to the government and so on. Now here's a child who didn't get much, or couldn't because of his father's frugality and so on. But often, and many psychologists would say that a child who grew up like that tend to want to grab and me, and tend to become selfish and want to acquire. What changed you? What helped to mold you into this person who you have become, and when did that transformation took place? Was there any defining moment in your life?
I mean, I'm not sure they're defining a defining moment. And let me clarify something, Selwyn. We never grew up. We were very middle class, and in some respects, probably even upper middle class growing up. My father was a minister in the government. We never sat around wondering what we were going to eat from one day to the next. Mm-hmm. And that for me is very important, because it taught me very early on, as I said, is that literally you do not need as much as you think you do. You certainly don't need as much as most people around you think that is needed to survive and to prosper. So it wasn't very difficult for me making some of these choices growing up. You talk about people who haven't had a lot growing up tend to grab, and that's absolutely true, and that's logical, and that's understanding. In a sense, I had a slightly different challenge. My parents could provide a lot more than we needed, and even a lot more than we wanted. But in many respects, they chose not to, just to demonstrate that actually you could see you didn't need that many material things to survive and prosper. And that for me was a very powerful lesson, because now I've been very fortunate. I've had a very good career and been very successful in a number of areas. And I like to think that I am not consuming, I'm not accumulating stuff, which is unnecessary, and it makes for a very I don't feel burdened by obligations and expectations to accumulate, material things, and so I can focus on what really I'm passionate about, which is working with other people to make our lives and the lives of those less fortunate a lot better.
Many speak of social entrepreneurship. Many people are not familiar with the term. What is social entrepreneurship, and how is it related to creating wealth?
Okay, let me do it by describing what we're all very familiar with. We all go to work, and at the end of the month, we expect a paycheck, or at the end of 2 weeks, or whatever the period is. And that money symbolizes the value that we think our efforts are worth. Now, the reality is that in addition to needing money, we also have other needs. We need to make sure our environment is safe and healthy. We need to make sure that we can provide education for our kids. We need to keep healthy. Now, none of those things, Selwyn, we can measure in financial terms, but they're important. They're essential. If they're not there, then we can't function. Now, the question is, who creates that other stuff, that non-financial stuff? And that's what social enterprises are primarily focused on. Some of your listeners might be aware of something called Operation Hope, started by John Bryant, a very prominent and successful African American, who teach people how to manage money. Now, there's nothing about that outcome which can be measured in terms of dollars and cents, but it makes people more confident, it gives people more dignity, and it also ensures that they can transact life a lot more successfully. Now, those sorts of outcomes which we can't measure financially, that's what social enterprises seek to do. And in doing that, they provide the basis for wealth. So see it effectively as the platform on which you need to stand in order to eventually make lots of money. And that's what we try to do. So we set up companies which look like Pepsi, that has organizational structures with chief execs and financial officers and people in charge of marketing. But the outcome we're looking for at the end of the day is not necessarily to make the most money, but it's to produce an outcome, be it educating kids in inner cities, ensuring that healthcare is available to people who are homeless. Those sorts of outcomes we're looking for.
Kojo, you're saying this makes me wonder, how did you first got into this?
Well, it's firstly, again, as with most things, you got to go back. At a very early stage in life, and some of your listeners might be a little bit surprised or even appalled by this, but I grew up in an environment which was very left-wing, where, and again I must refer to my father, he taught us very early on to be almost disrespectful of money, that there was something much more important to strive for than making lots of money, and this was about doing good, this was about making a difference in people's lives. Now, I didn't know that anything such as social enterprise and social entrepreneurship existed. But very early in my life, it was very clear to me that there was something beyond making money which was even more important and more valuable. So that value was instilled, I think, very early, although I certainly didn't realize it then. So I went off to college, joined an investment bank, did very well, ended up in Southern Africa, first Zimbabwe, and then South Africa. And I remember one day I was driving home, and I live in a very nice suburb in Johannesburg, South Africa, and I passed some guys standing in the corner, begging, and they were selling newspapers. and a few months later, there were more of them standing there, and I felt a little bit threatened. I felt a little bit, wow, let me wind my windows up and feel a little bit more secure. And Selwyn, it occurred to me that even though I was driving home to a nice suburb, a comfortable home, and etc., that the fact that there were people out there whose lives were not getting better, in fact, they seemed to be getting worse, and there were more of them, made the quality of my life worse. Because now I had to not only worry about crazy motorists, I had to worry about people at the sides of the road who might, break my windscreen and try to harm me. Now, I then sat back and said, but Kojo, there must be something you can do. You spend a lot of time advising rich people how to get richer. There must be something you can do to make a difference in the lives of people who have a lot less than you do. And as I said before, I grew up, as a young person, knowing that there was a lot more to strive for than money. And I stopped one day and I asked them, I started chatting to some of these guys, and they told me that they sell a newspaper, and that's how they make money. They buy the newspaper for $1 and they sell it for $3. And it occurred to me that more than making money, they were changing their lives. And if I could help them organize themselves better, if I could help them get the newspapers at 50 cents rather than $1, if I could help them to market their newspapers at the corners of the roads better, they could they could make more money. But more than making more money, they could then start to take to send their kids to school, so the kids don't have to be at the side of the road, so the kids can get better education, and more and more selfishly, I could feel a bit safer because there were fewer people, indigent people on the streets. And that's how I got involved in Homeless Talk. It's a newspaper sold by homeless people, and that's how they eke a living. And that was really the start of the formal journey in social entrepreneurship. And then I discovered there's a whole world out there of people, young people, old people, striving to create this social capital, striving to create these public goods, health, education, a decent life for people. People are working with young women to reduce the level of violence against women and children. There's a whole universe out there. And if we don't look for it, to be quite honest, we'll never find it.
And so with that I ask, what does social entrepreneurship look like in the African context?
In the African context, lots of NGOs. Most non-for-profits, non-government organizations, trusts, etc., are to a large extent involved in social entrepreneurship. And I shouldn't give the impression that if you're a social entrepreneur, you have to live in poverty. The people running social enterprises have normal lives. But the big difference is perhaps is that rather than driving a Mercedes, they drive a Toyota. Rather than earning six-figure salaries, they earn healthy 5-6-figure salaries. But what they're creating is the basis for other people to do well.
And you've just visited Guyana, and went back to South Africa, went to I think Zimbabwe or Zambia or some one of those other countries and so on. But talking about social entrepreneurship, do you see evidence of it there, or how? Or opportunities in which you can introduce it to Guyana, or is there it's already established there?
Yeah, listen, I think there are a few countries in the world where there aren't social enterprises. They may not be called social enterprises because the term social entrepreneurship is being used relatively recently, and I think it's been it's replaced words like NGOs, non-for-profits, trusts, etc. Because the focus is more on saying we don't simply want to go and I don't want to set up an entity which, for example, will providing free meals to homeless people in Brooklyn by getting donations. I want to find a way to make it financially sustainable. So perhaps the people who are receiving the free meals they work in some way in order to generate the resources to give other people free meals so that it's financially sustainable. So some of it is semantic, some of it is a change of name, but social enterprises exist everywhere. And there's a focus on it in poorer countries because there are more of them. They're more necessary because lots of times the governments aren't in a position to provide all of these services which we take for granted. And it's exactly the same thing in Ghana. And you're quite right. I set up something called the Microlearning Trust in Guyana, which effectively is providing free access to an online platform for students at school so that they can test themselves. And of course, lots of the people listening will be from Ghana, and they know that people from Ghana, we're pretty obsessed about education. And it's not the case as it may have been that the government is able to provide a full range of educational services as they may have previously. So a small group of us, myself, Patrick Ketwaru and a few others, have set up this online platform where kids can go. Let's say you're a fourth form and you're doing chemistry and you've just studied, I don't know, atomic structures or organic chemistry. You can go and test yourself. Your teacher can see your performance and better able to assist you. And it's to date, we're only in the pilot stage, but it's proven to be very successful. Kids are very keen because they can learn at a much faster rate, and also teachers find it are reporting that they find it useful because they can see at a very detailed level how well the students are doing, and therefore do a lot better lesson planning. And we've gotten amazing support from the Ministry of Education and the government in general. Minister Manichand has given us much more support than we could have hoped for, and her team has been very cooperative. But they can use this data to plan much better. Do they want more chemistry teachers in Anna Regina, or do they need to put a few maths teachers more in Buxton? Because they can see at a glance how kids are performing and at a very detailed level. We're quite excited, and the idea is once we've rolled it out in Guyana is to take it across the Caribbean because it's a common syllabus. And our partners, we're doing it with the University of Salzburg in Austria, and they want us to look at taking it global. So we're quite excited about this. It'll be a first for Guyana.
Is this
a world-beating product.
Is this free for the students? Sorry.
It's absolutely free, and that's a principle of, as I told you, I grew up in a very left-wing environment. I'm a bit of a socialist, so it's good. Selwyn, I think you would have grown up with free education in Guyana, right?
Yes, I did.
Well, there you go.
Are there fundamental differences between social entrepreneurship and a traditional business entrepreneurship?
There's one big difference, and that difference, Selwyn, is what's the objective of the entity. As I like to tell people, social enterprises look like normal enterprises. They walk like normal enterprises. They employ marketers. They employ financial managers. They employ administrators. The big difference at the end of the day is that when you sit around the board table and you're looking at your results, rather than counting your outcomes in dollars and cents, you count it in terms of how many more kids have we educated, how many more housing have we provided for indigent families, how many more women and children are out of abusive situations. So that is the real difference. It's the outcome measure. But we need engineers, we need accountants, we need marketers, we need exactly the same sort of skill sets, but they're simply directed in a different manner.
You actually answered my next question about how do you keep score and how do you measure the progress. But as I mentioned to you, Kojo, this is a three-dimensional process. There's a chat room, and it's been active. So I'm going to go into the chat room and read some comments and questions. There are several good evenings, and then Mark Mack said, "Wow, empowerment of people, social entrepreneurship." Kali said, "Kojo, It's fascinating listening to your journey. Can a social enterprise like the newspaper program for the homeless be developed into a franchise? Hold that thought for a second.
Absolutely.
We'll get back to that.
Selwyn, I want to stop you there.
Okay.
Absolutely. In fact, that idea, I must confess, did not originate in South Africa. It originated in England. And actually, but the South African version is even better. And I think there are opportunities to do it globally. And so if that person is interested, very happy to speak to them offline and suggest how it could be effectively franchised.
Okay. Mark said, do you have any thoughts on aid versus private sector investment? What about the issue of services provided by NGO/NPO versus services provided by government/private enterprises?
Yeah, you want me to respond now?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Listen, there's an age-old debate about aid versus investment, and I think it's a red herring, to be quite honest. I think we must start from the end and say, what is the outcome that we're looking for? And let that decide whether or not aid or private investment is the best way to achieve it. We need to stop being ideological about this stuff. And if I could be a little bit critical, and I hope your audience doesn't mind, there's an assumption when I speak to people in America that if anything comes from government, it's bad. That's nonsensical. The New York subway is run by government. It's one of the most efficient and rational transport systems in the world, and the private sector could not possibly operate such an efficient system. And even if the New York subway doesn't make money, it ensures that millions of people every day can make money. Now, for me, New York subway is a social enterprise. Its success is not measured, or certainly shouldn't be measured by how much money it makes, but it must be clean, it must be safe for women, it must be efficient, and it must ensure equal access by everyone who lives in New York City. So I think the aid versus private sector thing is a little bit of a red herring. Mm-hmm. So, and I want to encourage some of your listeners to think about this. No one, when they get home at night, or very few people sit and said, you know what, I made $100 today. What most of us say is, I had a good day at work. I feel better now. I can see my kids are being better educated. So ultimately, no one really works for money. Money is simply a means by which we access those social goods, health, education, safety. So we mustn't see money as being the ultimate measure of our success, because when we're sitting on when we're lying on our dying bed, it doesn't matter how much money you have, it's not going to help you. But if you live a healthy life, if you have people around who love and cherish you, if you have, so let's not get too carried away with this ideological discussion.
Kali said, another question: can franchising be used as a model to sustain social enterprises?
Yeah, and it's very common. It's franchising has a bad name in many areas, but I can tell you that in social enterprises, it's a common way of rapidly replicating a useful model.
Mm-hmm. And Carl asked, what are the new approaches employed by social entrepreneurs to avoid the pitfalls of legacy NGOs, etc.? Well,
couple ones come to mind. One is get skilled people. Traditionally, a lot of people who went into NGOs did so because they either weren't as successful as they hoped they might have been in the private sector. So it tended not to attract the best and the brightest. That's changed. Mm-hmm. Lots of the kids who approach me to find them opportunities are Harvard graduates or top-rate people. Secondly, we mustn't settle for second best, and lots of times NGOs settle for second best outcomes because it's seen as serving people who are not necessarily as well off as we do. So it's about excellence. It's a focus on excellence that must be maintained.
Mm-hmm. Karen said, "Hi Kojo, good to see you since Greenheart Street. You grew up in a rich environment from both your mother and father. In terms of the social entrepreneurs, I think we are in dire need of mentors. How do you plan to implement an incubator to grow the minds of the young?"
wow, she required, that's a godlike request. Not sure I could quite fit that. Listen, I think mentorship is very important. And Karen, hi from Greenheart Street. Those are great days for me. I'm not sure I have a plan to incubate, to implement an incubator, but again, that's a discussion that, might be taken up. I myself, every Saturday that I'm in South Africa, I try and assemble 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 young people, and we sit and have coffee, and that's my sort of pseudo mentoring, and I think it's much more important to do the mentoring of people, and then they can give rise to brilliant ideas. But I'd be interested to take up that suggestion offline.
Okay, and Karen said, again, I really think that mentoring is one of the most important investments we can have in any society to propagate forward movement compared to aid. And then Mark asked the question, will social enterprise expansion result in the demise or relevance of government?
Of government? No, not really. Social, well, to some extent over the last, since the Reagan Thatcher era of the late 70s, early 80s, the role of government has been shrinking quite rapidly. And in many places, social enterprises have arisen or become more important because of that. But social enterprises, those of us in the space would be arrogant to think that we could replace governments. Governments are indispensable. And in many cases, I think governments are too small. No, they wouldn't. They complement. And the challenge is, how do we divide up the space in a way which is rational?
Andrea asked, as Honorable Consul, what specific consular services do you provide in South Africa? What percentage of this work is geared towards nationals, tourists, and businessmen?
Selwyn, I didn't get the last bit of that, but okay. I understand the question.
The last bit is, what percentage of this work is geared towards nationals, tourists, and businessmen?
As an honorary consul, we provide primarily what I call consular services, which are providing visas, advising people who want to go to Ghana, and also Guyanese who are outside of Ghana in the areas that we cover with various services such as getting their passports renewed, etc. We don't get involved in political representation, and we get involved in economic facilitation really on an ad hoc basis. It's not particularly well structured, and it usually relies on the interests of the honorary consul himself. If he's a businessman, then he normally engages in activities aligned to his own interests, because we don't get paid. It's another form of national service. Very little of it is directed towards the private sector, which I think is a little bit of a mistake. It's mainly around consular services. And in any event, the opportunities for economic activity, are different as compared to, say, if you were in the US or the UK or the Caribbean.
Kojo, this conversation is going so well in its trajectory, and I kind of I'm hesitant to go to where I'm going right now, but I will ask it. You said, mentioned that you grew up in a liberal environment, and you had good times when you were young, going to school and so on. Can you say at any point during that period, I mean, we were all young men and going to school around the same time, that you were ever rebellious?
Okay. And Simon, just a little note that I'm not sure if it's the link, but the reception is getting a little bit fuzzy and you're breaking up a little bit.
All right.
But rebellious, yes. I'm not sure I should be admitting this. I like lots of young people, you go through, particularly in your puberty, a lot of attention-seeking phase. And I remember when I was I didn't always find school very difficult. So lots of times it probably wasn't as exciting or as engaging as it might have been. And I remember when I was in fifth form, there was a particularly bad time, I suppose a coincidence of all the hormonal changes and everything. I started to go to school with my hair plaited, and that didn't attract a lot of attention. And so I have five sisters. I grew up with five sisters, so I got a lot of female influences in my socialization and probably even genetics. And so then I started to wear nail polish to school. Firstly with what's it called, the plain transparent one.
Right.
And then when no one noticed, I then started to put on red nail polish. Now by this time my father was the Minister of Education, so and we used to have big fights, political fights. I used to have big political fights with him. So partly was rebelling against him, partly was rebelling against youth, and I stopped wearing shoes. I would wear slippers to school. I was bored. So I suppose that would count as my rebellion. Nothing spectacular.
I remember during our time, Rastafarianism came in into the society. Lots of Bob Marley. A lot of us embraced Bob Marley and did a lot of stuff that would have considered by mainstream quite rebellious and so on. Was there? Did you have any of those influences?
We grew up around the same time, Selwyn. We were all sort of middle class guys who were pretending to be radicals, and Bob Marley was utterly influential in my life. My one claim to fame is that I think I know the words of every Bob Marley song. I got beautiful memories of growing up in South Rhineville, and we would hang out on the road. We would lime on the roads until fairly late at night. And there was a big gang of us. Jeremy Roberts, who now is a proper Rastafarian in DC, Carly Guard, Flude, Jack Harrop. The absolute huge amount of guys, and it really centered around Old Fort Hockey Club. Mm-hmm. And we would sit at the corner. I think it's Tukite and Greenheart Street, and have deep discussions around the meaning of Bob Marley songs and Rastafarianism. And for us, Bob Marley was literally a prophet. It was the closest thing we had to being a saint, and we would literally study and argue about the words of the songs. And if you didn't know the words, it wasn't very cool. So I know today, if you drive with me in my car, I'm a bit boring. I really only play Bob Marley and some Mary J. Blige, but and for me, it really provides a sort of socio-philosophical anchor. You were playing Natural Mystic at the start at the top of the program, and there's a part which talks about many more will have to suffer, many more will have to die. Don't ask me why. Selwyn, you probably wouldn't appreciate it, but for me, that was very powerful, because the notion of dying is not necessarily, dying in a normal sense, but people who get lost in anonymity, etc., in order to push forward societies, and those millions and hundreds of millions who we never really know, but who are important in the process. And when I hear those lyrics, it reminds me that those of us who've been fortunate, who might have done better than the average, that we have an obligation to try and make those millions out there, those unknown, anonymous millions, make their life a little bit easier, because they provide the platform for the next generation to succeed. So no, I could talk all day long about Bob Marley songs, because there's not a single Bob Marley song, Selwyn, where I can't relate to some aspect of my life or some aspect to global politics, etc.
You're saying that, Kojo. It gives me a very good introduction into one of our topics tonight, and that is, do we owe our homeland? And I'm saying this because you mentioned getting together with the likes of Carly Guard and Jeremy Roberts and all, a whole bunch of guys discussing Bob Marley lyrics and so on. I had my own time doing that, but many of us are no longer in Guyana. We have migrated to the United States and other parts of the world. And one of your topics tonight is, do we owe our homeland? We not.
Yeah.
We'll take a.
Okay, let's take a short break. And I promise we are going to get into that when we get back.
Sure.
Back. My guest tonight is Kojo Paris. Kojo, wonderful to have you. As I said before the break, we'll get into do we owe our homeland. But before I do that, let me go back into the chat room and take read this question. Mark Max asked, from my work in low-income countries, one observation is that NPO are promoting social entrepreneurship. However, in some instances, the NPO lack strong management and governance accountability.
Yeah, and I share that observation, and it's a real problem. But that problem is not just restricted to NGOs and social enterprises. Even in traditional companies, I mean, if you look at the amount of frauds and corporate governance challenges we've had either in Wall Street or Exxon, that's a common problem. So it is true, and social enterprises tend to probably suffer a little bit more because there aren't as many established rules as there are for traditional entities. But it's a global challenge across all categories of entities.
And Drea asked, do you have an idea of the size of the Guyanese community in South Africa?
Yeah, we reckon it's probably between 50 and 60 or a little bit more in South Africa itself, most of whom are students studying Islam, actually, probably half of it. But in Southern Africa, there are a lot more Guyanese in Botswana, for example, than there are in South Africa. I reckon there are probably anywhere between, probably about 100 Guyanese in Botswana. There are a few in Namibia. Probably 10, 20 or so in Zambia. And really across Africa, there are sprinklings. Remember, we Guyanese are a wandering lot. But yeah, probably about 50 in South Africa.
And Kali asked, can you tell us about a time when your efforts have influenced public policy?
Public policy? Gosh. If you mean public policy in South Africa, it'd be a little bit arrogant for me to suggest that it did. What I can say, though, is that generally the work we did in creating courses which allowed persons to transition from traditional businesses into social enterprises has meant that there's been a mushrooming of social entrepreneurship courses, and the government has responded in South Africa, not just to our efforts. I mean, there are lots of other people involved in this stuff, by putting money into the space. So, that may be one example. And certainly what we're doing in Guyana with the Microlearning Trust, we expect it's going to influence the way in which education is delivered. And eventually, not just in Guyana, but, Selwyn, I don't want to sound too immodest, but we're determined that the Microlearning Trust is going to be a global success and a global game changer.
Congratulations, my brother. You envision it, you see it, and it becomes a reality. I like that. You got to work hard between all of that. as a social entrepreneur, how do you balance your social and financial goals?
Me specifically, as I said, I've been a little bit lucky, so I don't necessarily need to spend as much time worrying about the former. Right. But I think generally, if one gets into the social space, you have to make a decision as to what material lifestyle is comfortable for you. Comfortable both in material terms, but also in terms of, the expectations of those to whom you're responsible. Because you have partners, you have kids, you have parents, family, relatives who depend on you. And that's a trade-off that is a very individual one, and there's no formula for it.
Carl asked, what inspired you to invest your talents in Africa?
What inspired me to what?
To invest your talents in Africa.
Well, no, I mean, working in Africa was a little bit of a coincidence. I was working in London for an investment bank called Rothschilds, and they wanted, they effectively approached me to join the firm because, in their words, they were looking for people who looked like me but spoke English properly to send to Africa. And that, and after wanting to punch the guy, I realized that I wanted to get out of England, and it was a great opportunity to go and work in Africa. So that's how I ended up in Africa. There wasn't a great plan of mine to end up in Africa. And once I started to live here, the lifestyle is, I must tell you, incredible. I certainly would not. You'd have to pay me billions to leave here to live in New York.
I guess
the lifestyle is fabulous, but also, especially when you start getting old like me and approaching middle age, there's a sense of purpose because you're working in an environment which increasingly you can relate to. And identify with, and therefore you want to do well, you want to succeed and make a contribution.
So are there boundaries for social entrepreneurship? For example, situations where it would not be effective?
Yeah, sure. In the same way that there are boundaries for normal companies or boundaries for government. But all of this is being negotiated, and it depends on where you are. So let me give you a practical example. If you are living in New York, there really is no need for you or let's say you're living in Connecticut, where there's a great education system. There's very little scope for you to invest as a social enterprise in providing education for indigent people or people who haven't got access to education, because very few people don't have access. However, if you fly 14 hours and you end up in Senegal, huge opportunities. So it's really contextual, and if you want to get involved in social enterprises, then you need to do an analysis as if you were going to set up an investment bank or set up a retail shop. You have to say, what's the demand in your environment, in that specific environment, for the outcome which you're looking for.
So how do you cope with setbacks, and how do you maintain energy and drive during the hard times?
So how do I maintain what?
Energy and drive during the hard times. How do you cope with setbacks?
There's a Chinese saying. Selwyn, my great-grandmother is Chinese, hey?
Oh, I didn't know.
Yeah, Annie Lee. There's a Chinese saying, find something you love and you'll never work another day. And
I believe that.
I keep saying, but it's true. I've been extraordinarily lucky because when people ask me what my job is, I don't know what to tell them because none of it seems like work, to be quite honest.
Mm-hmm.
There's some days I get up and I like everyone else, I don't particularly feel like facing the world. But at the end of the day, the results are obvious. The kids I mentor, I see them doing well, and they write me shorter and shorter letters because they become more and more important. The people I work with, either in education or in healthcare or whatever, I see their lives improving. I see, young women becoming much more confident and empowered in their roles. There are just so many examples, and the thing is that there's just so much work to do.
Right.
It's not very hard to keep interested and motivated.
Mark asked, is there a nexus between social entrepreneurship and microfinance?
Microfinance. Well, microfinance is a subset of social entrepreneurship.
Mm-hmm. So, Mark just gave me an idea. I'm going to postpone the topic, do we owe our homeland, for a little later. I want to get into creating wealth because I think it's a very important topic. Is the African entrepreneur who gets a micro loan and supports his or her family and community much different fundamentally from Bill Gates or Steve Jobs?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you repeat it?
Is the African entrepreneur who gets a micro loan and supports his or her family and community much right?
Yeah, listen, you know, in poor societies, be it, you know, as compared to wealthy societies, and the comparison doesn't necessarily need to be, you know, Africa against the US. It could be even within the US. People in poor circumstances have much more basic objectives in life. They need to eat. They need to have secure accommodation. They need to be safe. You know, so the comparison, and so the comparison between someone getting a microloan and Bill Gates, etc., is simply that Bill Gates doesn't wake up worrying about where his next meal comes from. So in a sense, he can focus on higher order issues. He can look at the globe and say, right, which country shall we focus on? Which disease shall we attack? You know. So it's really an issue of scale, both in terms of size, but in terms of complexity.
Okay. Mark asked, if there is a connection, is microfinance working beneficially or another means of abusing poor people?
Sorry, working where, in Africa or generally?
Well, I'm not sure where he's speaking generally.
Okay. Well, let me say this, and these are generalizations. And so there'll be variances. I think microfinance works particularly well where you have people who understand money and have a socialization which is biased towards enterprise. Because microfinance doesn't work in an environment where people simply see themselves as consumers. Because the idea of microfinance is to access increasing quantities of finance to create new wealth and new value, you know, in a good capitalist way. So you know, we have to identify certain preconditions where microfinance works and where it doesn't work. And I've seen both great successes, like there's something called the Kuyasa Fund in Cape Town, which uses microfinance to help people to improve the quality of their accommodation. And it works splendidly well. And then you could, you know, just as well in Cape Town itself, look at other examples, which I shan't name, where people simply took the money and spent it on beer and alcohol. It's not going to work really well there.
Yep. The chat room is filling up. I want to ask this question because it relates. It's relative. It's no secret that the lack of funding opportunity is one of the major disadvantages organizations face. What strategies have been most successful for you in acquiring funding for your ventures?
Yeah, you know, I gotta disagree with that assumption. You know, and it's a common assumption that people make, you know, be it in normal businesses, whether you're looking to raise $1 billion or whether you're looking to raise $100. Firstly, there's no shortage of money. Generally, there's a shortage of good ideas. You know.
Kojo, not money, but funding opportunities.
But that's what I'm saying. There's no shortage of money. You know, there's no shortage of capital globally. Very few places have a deficit of capital. In my experience as a traditional banker and even as a social entrepreneur, the main challenge is that firstly, we all believe that our idea, which we've spent 5 years thinking about and writing a great business plan for, is the best idea and therefore it deserves financing. Sorry, that's not the case. You know, the vast majority of projects which are proposed, the reality is that they're not fundable either from a straight financial perspective or even from a social entrepreneurial perspective. And that's a hard truth for people to face. And also, there's an assumption that simply because I come up with a business plan, someone is obliged to fund it. That's not the way, that's not the way of the world, I'm afraid. The other myth is that everyone can be an entrepreneur. Less than 1% of human beings have the prerequisites for being successful entrepreneurs. I may teach entrepreneurship as I do. I may involved in mentoring people, but I certainly know that I'm not an entrepreneur in the classic sense of it. You know, I haven't had a socialization, and my approach to risk is very different from true entrepreneurs. So I gotta contest that contention, Selwyn.
Mm-hmm.
If you know, the reality is that if you have a great plan and if you market it well, you will get capital, and it's not money. Usually, is the main resource in making business plans successful and a business successful. You know, management and human resources, I believe, in my experience, are a lot more important than financial capital.
Agree. And Dre asked, do you foresee the BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, being headquartered in South Africa, or is the geographic location of South Africa a major logistical impediment to this?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. You know, I attended a conference recently to do with BRICS, and it's all the rage. Let me say a couple of things. Firstly, there are a lot of questions as to the composition of BRICS. You know, BRICS was an acronym dreamt up by a clever investment banker to try and sell some new products. You know, there's nothing necessarily rational about Britain, about Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa as a coherent economic bloc. And South Africa certainly is an outlier, both geographically, size-wise, and in terms of economic performance. So South Africa's headquarters, probably not. You know, I think it would have to compete with Brazil. And you know, I would actually think that Brazil would probably become the center of BRICS for lots of reasons. One, is a much more interesting place to live than the other places. And in terms of points on the trajectory, Brazil is probably going to outlast, except for China, going to outlast the rest of them. And China is not necessarily the most fun place to live.
Kali asked, I admire your genius. What is the best idea you've ever had?
Oh God, you know, this is one of those traps where you believe this. No, I'm not a genius. Not by any chance. You know, I think the best idea I ever had was to have my daughter. You know, I have an 11-year-old, and every day I regret not having more children. And every day I celebrate the fact that I was part of producing, you know, this amazing human being, and I feel a huge sense of responsibility, but real joy. You know, I never knew I could love so much and so deeply, and so unconditionally, and for me, it's the best thing ever.
And Kali asks, what do you say to those who are daunted about repatriating and worry about the lack of financial capital and infrastructure?
Yeah, I suspect the question is people who want to set up businesses. Firstly, you know, as I said before, 99% of people are going to need to get a job, to be brutally honest. You know, it's not very few of us will be successful owners and managers of business. But what we can be, though, we can become entrepreneurial employees. And let me explain what I mean. You know, I always tell people that we should stop focusing on creating entrepreneurs and instead focus more on empowering people to behave entrepreneurially. You know, and it's a real bear bug of mine. You know, it's for example, you know, you'd go. Let me tell you a real example. I was in Guyana recently, and I traveled from Anna Regina, and I had to go to an important meeting. In fact, there was a presentation at the University of Guyana, and I had a white shirt on. And coming on the boat from Anna Regina, the shirt got dirty. Now, I couldn't go home and change, and I was passing a laundry, and I stopped at the laundry and I said, "Listen, you know, can you clean the shirt for me? You know, I got an hour." The woman said, no, you know, I can only deliver it tomorrow. I said, "But please, you know, how long does it take to wash it?" She says, "About 5 minutes." I said, "How long will it take to dry?" She says, "About 10 minutes." I said, to iron? She says, probably another 10 minutes. So I said, you could do this in 25 minutes. You know, why do I have to wait until tomorrow? And she looks around, you know, looks at her boss. Her boss looks away. And in the end, she agreed to do it. Now, if she was acting entrepreneurially in the first case, you know, despite the fact that she's an employee, she would have said, fine, but it's going to cost you 50% more, you know. So you don't have to, you know, we all will not become entrepreneurs, but we can all act more entrepreneurially. And that way we can, one, make the entities in which we work in a lot more effective and a lot more efficient. And hopefully we can then do better because it's going to make more profit and we're going to make more money, and, you know, people are going to have their white shirts clean.
What does the question, do we owe our homeland, what does that mean to you, Kojo?
So, homeland.
Yes.
You know, I must confess that I'm 47 and I've lived more than half my life out of my country of birth. And the country which perhaps has made the biggest impact in my life, both in materially and in terms of shaping who I am, is Zimbabwe, where I lived for 7 years. Now, I've lived in South Africa for 11 years now. So I ask you, where's my homeland? You know, when we were growing up, Selwyn, people didn't travel as much as they do now. So your loyalty was geographically defined. You know, when you traveled to the US, it was, you know, your whole family would turn up to the airport. Now, no one even turns up. You know, a taxi drops you off at the airport. So there's the notion of homeland is probably a little bit dated. However, if we talk about what's the obligation we have to the land where we were born, then I think it's a much more interesting discussion. And I think for someone like myself, I still travel on a Guyanese passport. You know, I've had opportunities to have British, Zimbabwean, South African citizenship and documents, and you know, because I can very clearly trace the success I've had, limited as it is, to factors in the land of my birth, because I have relationships there. You know, as we say in Guyana, because my navel string is buried there, I feel a sense of obligation to do something about Guyana or in Guyana. Now, lots of people would have had very different experiences, and therefore they wouldn't necessarily have that same sense of obligation. But what I think is that what we should do is, wherever we feel a sense of comfort, a sense of belonging, we should commit to making a contribution to that society, in that environment, to that community. Yeah, so homeland, tricky concept these days. You know, is it where you pay your taxes? Is it the passport you use? Is it where you live? Yeah. But I know where you're coming from with the question, and let me be clear about something. Particularly if you come from countries like Guyana, which are less developed, which have persistent challenges, I think we need to think seriously about how we can use our skills, our networks, and our own resources to make a difference. And that's something that I've personally committed to doing. So, yeah, I feel personally committed to making a difference in the land of my birth.
You know, I've had many conversations with our dear friend Carl, and where we talked a lot about, you know, the abundance of intellectual capital. For instance, one environment you find that is Facebook. Abundance of intellectual capital, abundance of academic capital. And the question becomes, how do we use this? How do we harness this and channel it effectively and efficiently into developing our country? If for instance, you do have a sense of obligation, how do we do that? Do you believe it's possible? And with that, I would ask this question: what are some of the challenges what are some of the challenges in repatriation or is
Yeah,
repatriation actually necessary?
first, I think repatriation is very, very difficult.
Yeah.
Less than 5% of people, and this is globally, not just to do with Guyana and the Caribbean, will ever go back to the country that they've left. And that's for a whole heap of reasons, and we could talk for hours on that. So we shouldn't see repatriation as being the objective, because it's not very practical. You know, the more interesting issue is, how do we mobilize a huge resource base, as you say? And it's not simply intellectual capital, it's it's all sorts of other capital which we can, both real financial capital and sort of communitarian type capital, networks, etc. And I'm very clear about this. Countries like Guyana we have to invest a lot more energy and genius into mobilizing people like yourself. You know, you have a program here which is going to go out to, I don't know, lots of people. Apparently you're the most important. This is the most important radio show apparently in New York, I hear, Selwyn.
Is that so?
So, governments and communities can use these sorts of fora in order to mobilize not even just Guyanese resources, but there are lots of non-Guyanese who may be interested in assisting Guyana. But if we look specifically at people who were born in Guyana, the internet and those sorts of fora provide opportunities for us to deploy those resources. Let me give you some practical examples. There's something called telemedicine. And it's been around for a while, particularly in developed countries. You know, if I'm a great surgeon or a great doctor with some specialism, I can diagnose using webcams, etc., someone thousands of miles away, and I can even direct surgery for that person from. I don't have to be in the same location as theirs. Now, Guyana has hundreds of great surgeons. I mean, Samantha Tross, living in England, for example, was the first pediatric orthopedic surgeon, I think, female black orthopedic surgeon in England. Now, Samantha doesn't have to go to Ghana to have Guyanese benefit from her expertise. Using the techniques such as telemedicine, she can direct people in Guyana, she can make diagnoses, etc. And her skill and her ability can be felt in Guyana, even though she's sitting comfortably, having coffee in a cafe in London.
Right.
And even things like we're doing with Microlearning Trust. There's an amazing entrepreneur called Lily Bengford, who's based in Washington, who is a Guyanese who went to the US many years ago. She's been very successful in IT, etc. Now, I call on her when we have issues to do with how do we configure various things to do with our platform. She doesn't have to go back to Guyana, So the answer is yes, and yes, and it's a space which is not utilized aggressively enough. It's a resource which is not tapped. You see, the problem is if you approach people who have kids, who have mortgages, who have car payments to make, and you said, I think you should be going back to Guyana, rather than engage them, I think you repel them. Because they feel guilty, they feel, as if you're putting them in a tight corner. Why do that? Doesn't make sense.
I agree. I agree 100%. I had a conversation recently with a friend, and I'm going to have her on the show at some point, who was in Guyana and working on delivering produce that are grown and manufactured in Guyana. And the challenge, she said, for them is to get it on a consistent basis to meet the commercial demands. But one of the things that really struck me is her request for grant writers, because there are organizations who are willing to fund some of these enterprises, but they need efficient and effective grant writers. And that was kind of interesting to me, is that here she says, look, Selwyn, we need those, and it speaks to what you're saying. How can we utilize our skills? How can we put it together and create a functioning and effective network? So and none of this is easy, and I don't want to suggest that
the government and the people in charge in our countries are not making efforts to do this, they got huge problems, and they got, and lots of times there's a certain antagonism between people in the diaspora in relation to governments, and we must be conscious of that dynamic also. People don't want to think that, we failed, therefore we have to go abroad and look for talent, etc. So there's another side of the coin, Selwyn. It's not simply about how do governments utilize their diasporan populations. I think those of us who, like yourself, like myself, who feel a sense of obligation to the places of our birth, must mobilize. Must get together in small groups and said, guys, let's go down for a holiday in Guyana. We're going to go and spend 2 weeks, but 3 days we're going to spend, using our skills in some way which is beneficial. And these sorts of things are not new. They're not novel ideas. Other communities, for example, for a long time now, the Jewish population in places like the US and America would go to places like Israel and make real contributions, while having a holiday or while meeting, going to meet family, etc. We don't have to invent a lot of new things. These things are being done every day. We simply need to look at best practice.
I agree, and I would ask your advice or your take on this. I think, and I've had several conversations with many people who have tried to do that or have done that, but sometimes there isn't much of a synergy between what they're wanting to do or their efforts and the bureaucracy, and so a lot of times people leave feeling frustrated. I had an experience when I was in Guyana over the Christmas holiday. This young lady, she's a nurse, does cardiac nurse, and she wanted to provide her services and so on, but it was very difficult for her to do that at that time. But anyway, many of us who've gone to school together and so on, some of us are in key positions. So there was some discussion made, and the next time she visits, it would be an easy.
Yeah, Selwyn, I think. Let me just comment briefly on that. A couple of points. One, planning. Mm-hmm. And secondly, if it doesn't work the first time, try it again.
I agree.
But thirdly, and I think probably most importantly, rather than starting from the perspective, and I don't want us to suggest that a cardiac nurse shouldn't have done what she did, but perhaps the way to approach it is to say, what is the requirement in Guyana? Mm-hmm. Okay? Or what is the requirement in Jamaica or wherever we're talking about? And then work back from that and match what I do to that requirement, rather than saying, this is what I do, I want to find something to do, I want to find a round hole to put my square peg in. Mm-hmm. Okay? Gotcha. It's to work from, be demand driven, and also don't make and also you got to be flexible. I may be a cardiac nurse, okay, but I have a general nursing skill, so just go and volunteer at the hospital. Go to Uncle Eddie's home. I don't necessarily have to perform as a cardiac nurse 24/7.
Bo asked, do you think that creating that entrepreneurial environment within small business less than 50 million is the responsibility of the business owner, or should it be a combined effort of formal education with practical experience?
Yeah, I think increasingly what more progressive governments are realizing is that they need to provide a broad environment in which people can act more entrepreneurially. If you look at very successful countries, particularly in East Asia, and more than the government, the state, because it doesn't matter if the political parties change. The education system, the broad environments, the sorts of even games that kids grow up playing are increasingly being oriented so that kids can analyze, can problem solve. And in a sense, entrepreneurialism is really just, structured problem solving in some respects, So it's not, by the time you go into the job environment, in lots of respects, it's a little late to be entrepreneurially inclined. If I grow up and my father's a trader and I'm sitting at his feet all day long in the shop while he's bargaining with suppliers and clients, I'm going to be more entrepreneurial, even if than someone who goes to Harvard, after having spent their time, with a father who was a public servant. That's socialization is much more important than education in terms of entrepreneurialism. Mm-hmm. So there's a need at a very early age for people to be exposed to these sorts of environments. So it's a shared responsibility.
And Kali asked, I understand that Benin offers repatriation tours. Have you heard about that?
Sorry, Selwyn, you're really breaking up badly. Okay. It's sounding very muffled.
Is this much better?
Yeah.
Okay, I understand that Benin offers repatriation tours. Have you heard about
Benin?
that? Benin, right. And have you heard about that? And if so, what are your thoughts? How successful is the program for Benin?
I've heard, I haven't heard it being called repatriation tours, but I know a number of countries offer opportunities to people in the diaspora, and it generally tends to be African countries, to go and, I'm not sure what exactly the objective is. Let me be a little harsh here. I think this is all romanticism, mm-hmm. and not particularly practical or useful, to be quite honest. As we've established, most people are going to die where they were born or where they live as adults. Mm-hmm. I think if you're trying to generate some tourist income by offering repatriation tours, then it's a great little scheme. Okay, but if you're trying to get people to move back, firstly, how many people, if I'm a product, a second generation product out of Benin or Guyana, I got no really emotional relationship to the place. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's an exercise in romantic futility, mm-hmm. to say that, okay, we're going to come back. There's not, and people generally move to environments where they can do better. And you don't have to put them on tours to do it. Human beings are very resourceful and very, and very self-interest seeking. So I think you get a sense. I don't really think much of those things.
Okay. Karen asked, I would say all the said developing environments need to plan and streamline their requirements and make it available to work. What is the real requirement in the Caribbean countries and in Guyana?
Ooh. Karen, that's a huge question, and here's what I can say. We suffer from a particular challenge in the Caribbean, which is scale. There are not enough of us to generate internal markets which allow the creation of products or even people to take risk, because once you fail, the society is pretty unforgiving. I think what we have to do, though, is to spend a little bit more time focusing on what I would call more or endeavors which require intellectual capital rather than the classic, factory, etc. Mm-hmm. Type entrepreneurialism. So our policy needs to be focused more on developing amazing human beings. So the point made earlier about, socialization is really important. The internet must be free. We mustn't be paying for access to stuff like that because that's information. So there's some very basic things that we can do.
And the next question, Karen, we are so disorganized that we can't really communicate effectively with those wanting to. The diaspora... We are so disorganized that we can't really communicate effectively with those wanting to. The Diaspora project in Guyana came to New York, and I asked, and I got blank stares. Yeah. And then Mark.
But let me stop you there, Selwyn, and I want to challenge the person who posed the question. Mm-hmm. The diaspora, and I'm being a little defensive here because I think the Diaspora project is an interesting initiative by the government, but we can't shirk personal responsibility here. It's not simply about people reaching out from Guyana. People have to reach into Guyana and recognize that the challenges faced by anyone, it doesn't matter which political party, trying to run Guyana are huge. And those of us who think that we want to assist must stop being, must stop looking for the sort of one-way flow of stuff. If we're not interested in helping Guyana, then that's fine. You have a right to do that. But don't be unnecessarily and irrationally critical of efforts as tentative and initially unsuccessful as they might be. Let's be a little bit more forgiving of each other.
And Mark Mack said, great conversation, very informative. Divya, great conversation. In the wake of the financial markets meltdown, how can financial engineering benefit social entrepreneurship and be a force for positive change and goodwill?
A huge amount. And I think part of the reason, to be quite honest, I have enjoyed and been relatively successful in social entrepreneurship is because I come from investment banking, where it's really all about swings and roundabouts and in financial engineering. So, because financial resources available to social enterprises are even more limited than normal enterprises, financial engineering, the more efficient use of financial capital is even more critical.
Can you talk about the Rima Fund? How did this venture start, and what was the state of social entrepreneurship in Guyana 30 years ago?
Yeah, briefly speaking, I think, I'm trying to remember when it started. The Rima Fund started in London. It was myself, my cousin Raul, who's an investment banker, and David Pollard, who I think still is an investment banker. And I think it's probably about 17 years ago, something of the sort. We were sitting, I had too much to drink one evening, and we said, listen, we're probably never going to go back to Guyana. Why don't we every month take, I think at the time it was £25, which is probably about $40. And every month we put it together and we look for projects in Guyana to support. And we've done this, as I said, for the last 15, 17 years, I can't remember how long. And it's certainly something we've been trying to extend to the US, where there's a much bigger market, a lot wealthier people, etc. And I think at the last count, probably about 20 to 30 different enterprises we've assisted. People in Sophia, women in places like Buxton and Annandale with sort of little chicken coops and stuff like that. There's been a whole range of stuff, but it's not huge amounts of money. Probably on average $1,000-2,000 US dollars. But in the context of Guyana, that tends to be, in the context of small enterprises, I think we haven't done very badly.
Are there practices and lessons learned from Africa about social innovation? For example, Teach Zimbabwe, which you co-founded, that we can apply to Guyana and the Caribbean and vice versa?
Absolutely. Teach Zimbabwe is something I started about 8 years ago when Zimbabwe went through, 5 years ago, Zimbabwe went through a very tricky political time where foreign countries and donors weren't willing to engage the Zimbabwean government. So Teach Zimbabwe really was set up as an intermediary, and the idea is to raise money to rehabilitate and create schools of excellence among what are called historically black schools. Now, it's partly because of my experience in that I then set up the Rima Learning Trust, which may look very different, but actually has the same objective as Teach Zimbabwe. So yes, those lessons are ongoing, and I think if you're humble enough in life, there are lessons all around. I visited a charter school in the Bronx, I think it was, a year ago, and I saw some amazing stuff being done. And and all of these experiences, you agglomerate and you take the good from them and you improve the bad from the stuff you're doing. So listen, Selwyn, I've really found a situation where I don't think I can learn something from it. And I think the moment you simply dismiss ideas, you dismiss people, you dismiss circumstances, you lose a lot. Very few things. I'm very happy to steal other people's ideas. Extremely happy.
ASEN, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. ASEN, African Social Entrepreneurs Network, functions as a supportive online environment for social enterprises and entrepreneurs in Africa. Is there a similar organization in the Caribbean?
No, there isn't. Although I've been speaking to some people in Guyana who are, gosh, who connected with the World Economic Forum, and trying to get something similarly set up. There's not really a significant and a coherent social entrepreneurship movement in the Caribbean. And like I said before, these things are contextual. In the Caribbean, it's very easy to survive. People don't die of starvation or exposure, and we don't tend to have, except for hurricanes and stuff like that, there are not a lot of life-threatening or lifestyle-threatening circumstances in the Caribbean in the same way as they are in many other places. So in some respects, the demand for social entrepreneurialism is very different.
Kojo, I always marvel at this, that this is a hour-and-a-half program, and the time just seems to fly out. And there are so many things I wanted to talk to you about. I wanted to ask you a little bit about microlearning. It's already 10:02. Can you spare an extra 5 minutes, sir? I know it's what, 2
for you, Selwyn, I can spare as much as you require.
This is what I'm talking about, but relationships and networking. The Roraima Learning Trust promotes the concept of microlearning in Guyanese schools. What is microlearning? Where did this concept originate?
Well, I don't know. The concept has always been around. I'm not sure where it's originating, but microlearning is conceptually something we all did. Microlearning simply says that you break complex facts, complex learnings into small pieces, and if you repeat it often enough, you will absorb it. It's what we all did with times tables, etc. Okay, so the concept is not very new. It's not very sophisticated. It's simply breaking complexity down into small, manageable pieces. Now, I first learned of it. I was sitting in Johannesburg Airport last year around now, and I was, this guy was, in fact, when I was on the plane flying, and this guy was sitting next to me. He's a professor at a university in Austria, and Selwyn, I have a position. In addition to paying for a seat on a plane, I also pay for the right to speak to anyone sitting next to me. So I started chatting to him, and he started to tell me what he did, and I thought, wow, this is quite amazing. So what they have done is they've created a program which allows people who haven't been able to finish formal education initially, to be able to, let's say you're a truck driver, and you want to become a nuclear scientist. So using your cell phone, you can effectively teach yourself, test yourself, various facts about nuclear, about atomic science, etc. And it means you don't necessarily have to be in a formal education context. And I thought about this, and it's only used in Europe. They only deploy this in Europe. And I thought, but wow, we have a problem with shortage of teachers. We have a problem with shortage of resources in Guyana. Why can't we use this in the education system? And the way we've used it is that we're effectively taking the entire bank of questions exam questions that from first to sixth form in schools and putting them onto a mobile platform so that kids can self-test themselves. We're not teaching necessarily kids new information. We're simply helping them to absorb the information faster. I'd be happy to share on your website access to a site where people can go and just play with it. But what it does, though, is it means that kids can, instead of only ever using on their computers or on their cell phones, can now help themselves to learn. And listen, we started a pilot about 6 weeks ago. It's been run at eight schools, although only 6 schools are up and running. And we've had, as of tonight, 12,000 accesses. Now let me tell you what that means. The pilot only involves about 120 kids, Selwyn. 120 kids to date, okay, over 6 weeks. And we've got about 12,000 accesses, which means that kids are going onto the platform more than one time per day, okay?
Wow.
And for me, that's fabulous,
Yeah.
okay? Because what it means is that kids are beginning to see that this thing can help them, and there's still some kind of excitement and novelty value. Now, by September of this year, if, inshallah, we shall be in every school, 4th, 5th, and 6th form. And by the end of the year, we want to be from 1st to 6th form, every kid in Guyana will have access to this platform.
Who's funding this?
So, sorry?
Funding.
Well, that's the great thing about it. You don't need a lot of money. Let's look at the key parts of it. The most important bit is how do you access it? Not everyone has a cell phone or a computer, and this is where the one laptop per family program, which the government has been rolling out for the past few years, has been invaluable. Ms. Boyce, who leads it, has been a great ally. The program is being preloaded onto every laptop, which is going out now. And in where we're doing the pilot, all the kids who haven't got laptops have been given laptops as part of the one laptop per family program. So there's no expense involved in that, either for us as the Roraima Learning Trust or for the kids involved. And that's due to a really amazing partnership we have with the One Laptop program. The other key thing is access, in terms of internet access. And there, a company called eNetworks, we've managed to persuade them to create hotspots in every school, pro bono. So kids can access the internet, and specifically the platform, pro bono, free.
Wonderful.
The third bit is content. Because even if you've got a laptop and you can access the internet, you have to have compelling content. And that's where, and I know we complain a lot about governments and how terrible they are, but I cannot praise Minister Manichan and PS Ned and Chief Education Officer Sam and Ms. Hamilton and the people in the Ministry of Education in Guyana. I cannot praise them enough for the cooperation that they've given us, because they've effectively said, if the teachers are willing, the subject teachers are willing, we can train them to become what are called content creators. So the pilot, which is being run with maths and chemistry, has seen about 10 teachers trained, chemistry and maths teachers trained on creating the content and uploading it onto the platform. Now, as we roll out across the rest of the country and across 10 subjects over the next few months, we're going to bring more teachers into the mix, So we've not had to spend a lot of money, and this is the point I made about social enterprises. Financial capital is not the critical thing in most entities. Through a set of relationships, we've managed to, I'm not able to well, I can't give you the amount of monies we've spent, but it's not a huge amount of money for what we've been able to achieve. But instead of money, we've leveraged partnerships.
You're talking about partnerships and these teachers being trained. Are people outside of Guyana who wish to volunteer allowed in this program?
Absolutely. Listen, I have an associate based here in South Africa. She's Serb, a Serbian young lady who's been helping with the program. She's never been to Guyana. She probably can't find Guyana on the map. Okay? But so I would be absolutely delighted if Guyanese abroad, either in terms of content creation, even if people who understand and have a grasp of how we can better structure the platform, or listen, I like free stuff. So any volunteers, very happy, very, very happy and excited to engage people. And listen, Selwyn, we started off now in schools, but the intention is very clear. Once we've covered first to sixth form, then we're looking at university level, and then at the third level, we're looking at primary schools as more and more kids use cell phones, which is inevitable.
Right.
Okay. And beyond schools, this is an application which, for example, we've been speaking to certain ministries where they have to train people. We've been speaking to certain professions like nursing, for example, not just the medical space, but engineers. The application is absolutely huge, which is why I said, you know, the team, the RLT team is convinced that we're onto a world beater here. There's nowhere else in the world where this sort of application is being rolled out in the way we're rolling it out. So we're very excited.
You have my support, and now that you're part of the CWS family, I am quite certain that you'll be coming back on at some time for us to continue this conversation, and you can talk some more about that. Kali said, wow, in addition to a wonderfully engaging conversation, Kojo gave us an amazing learning experience on the topic of social enterprises and success models brought to us via CWS. Thank you. So Kojo, now we have come to the close of our program, and I personally thank you very much. I mean, you know, it's really late, probably 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, or 4 o'clock in the morning in South Africa, and I can't express enough how grateful and thankful I am. Please share some closing thoughts, Kojo. Tell us why should we care about social entrepreneurship and how vital it is to our progress.
Let me say this, Selwyn. For me, it's an absolute joy, and you know, I don't want to sound as if I'm applying for sainthood or anything, but like I said right up front, if you find something you love, you will never work another day, because you know, a labor of love is you know, it's a beautiful thing. You know, and I always ask people, you know, why would you spend the best years of your life, when you're healthy, when you're most productive, doing something which isn't of lasting value? You know, so, you know, certainly at my point in life, and I think for people who are probably younger, I'd simply urge them to think a little critically about what they're doing, you know. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you give up your whole life and you change and you go to some commune somewhere. But think about little changes that you can make to your life, not just to make your life better, but also for those around you. You know, there's, you know, one of my favorite songs, and my own personal anthem, Selwyn, is probably a bit surprising. It's Michael Jackson's "Man in the Mirror." You know?
Yes.
And it's something I try and do every day. And in fact, not just every day, but almost every second of my life, which is to look at what I'm doing, to reflect on how I'm interacting with people, and the pain and the hurt and the discomfort or the joy that I'm causing other people, and say, how can I do things a little bit better? It doesn't have to be huge, just a tiny bit better, you know? So if you want to make the world a better place, take a look at yourself and make the change.
Oh man, that is beautiful. And Kojo, thank you so much.
Thanks, Selwyn. Anytime. See you in June.
Yes.
You owe me dinner.
I owe you dinner. That would be between me and Carl.
I don't know. You gotta.
Kojo, just to read a few comments. Dion said, Kojo, I am very impressed with your approach to revitalizing the educational system in Guyana utilizing technology. Wayne said, great insight into the workings of social enterprise and the impact it could have. Great job. Thank you very much. Thank you all for tuning in and listening. Kojo, thank you so very much for staying up and spending this time with us on CWS. This is Selwyn Collins saying good night and God bless.